Tales from the Ribble Valley by Cornelius MacManus and George Hull. A legal adventure. Readers of any experience will need no introduction to Mr. Brittle. He is known to all his admirers as the smartest and cleverest lawyer in the district. If you are in trouble with the law, go to Mr. Brittle. If you have an enemy upon whom you wish to take a public revenge, go to Mr. Brittle, and be sure to go soon. If you delay, your opponent will be certain to engage him, and then your case is as good as lost. No humbug about Mr. Brittle, no beating about the bush, no asking of foolish and unnecessary questions. Mr. Brittle commences the business with, "Now, you tell me all the truth about it, and I'll put rest in." Still, Mr. Brittle is a lawyer with great respect for the immense power and importance of the law. One morning he was sitting in his usual chair at the office, and opposite to him in the client's chair sat a woman whose dress and appearance plainly showed that she came from the country. "Yes," said the lawyer, commenting upon some information that had been given to him. "His name is Walmsley, and what did he do to you?" "He took a cow and stuck to it. It were one as always had a trick of getting wrong. Last Tuesday morning it get into his field, and he drove it into his own shipping." "Phew, that's felony. What excuse does he give for this kind of proceeding?" "Why, he says as we owe him for some hay. We never owed him for nothing. My gaffer's brother owed him for some, and went off to America about paying him, and now he wants to make us. The lawyers are on it. Did your husband promise to be responsible for the debt? Never in this world. Then Walmsley is in the wrong, and even if he were in the right, he can't take the law into his own hands and seize cattle in that style." "Oh, but he did do." "But he couldn't do." "But he did do. He owns to it," said the lady emphatically, striking her fat fist upon the lawyer's table. "Well," said Mr. Brittle, "I'll see what we can make out of it, that's all. Where's your husband? The action will have to be brought by him. I couldn't persuade him to come, he don't like law." "Sensible fellow," muttered Mr. Brittle under his breath. Then he drew himself to the table and remarked aloud, "Well, I'll send a clerk down this afternoon to take his instructions. Let your husband tell all the facts to him." The clerk went down. For a long time the old farmer was obdurate and firmly persisted that he didn't like law. At last, however, the clerk got all the information he required, every sentence of Mr. Warner's statement being marked with a declaration that he didn't like law. Mr. Brittle's clerk went down to try and persuade Mr. Warner to attend the court on the day of trial. In this he was entirely unsuccessful. Mrs. Warner, however, knew more of the facts than her husband did, and she was only too willing to be present at the trial to give the court the benefit of her evidence and as much of her opinions as the court would listen to. Such an event as a law do caused great excitement in the district in which the plaintiff and defendant resided. It seemed as if everyone between Walton and Ribchester had a personal interest in the matter. Farmer and ploughman, woodman and peasant, publican and sinner, exchanged opinions about the great dispute that was to be fought out in the Preston County Court. A few persons sided with the defendant and said that the debt for which he had seized the cow was a just one. Most of them, however, agreed with Mrs. Warner that the seizure of the beast was nothing but a robbery. They hoped that she would come off triumphant with the £30 and all costs, and they expressed their wonder that the claim was not for 60. To be sure, the leaders of the society of the district lay still a while, until they heard on every hand that Warner was sure to win. Then they became his best friends, and in many cases proffered pecuniary assistance. Farmer Gray, for instance, deeply regretted that he hadn't seen the occurrence, and therefore he could not be called as a witness, but he would lend his shandry and horse to carry the Warners to Preston and back. Being of a most enthusiastic turn of mind, Grace secreted a long pole banner under the seat, resolving that the victorious Warners should literally come home with flying colours after the trial. The day of trial came. Mrs. Warner and her witnesses were up early in the morning. They rode gaily off to town in Farmer Gray's cart, while Isaac Walmsley performed the same journey on foot. Why they started at such an early hour, neither themselves nor anyone else can tell. Like the bird who got up while it was yet too dark to see the worm, they found that they had made undue haste, and that the doors of the court would not open until fully a couple of hours after they got into town. The case of Warner against Walmsley was to be tried by a jury, like all the great law cases that the papers tell us about. It was afternoon before it was reached, and Mrs. Warner's patience was well nigh exhausted when at last the High Bailiff called the case. The attorney for the other side, too, here for the first time, put in an appearance. He was a thin, spare man with a weak voice. He did not seem to be very well known in court, and his talent, like his body, was a midget in comparison with that of Mr. Brittle. When the jury had been fully sworn to well and truly try the case, and had settled themselves as well as they could in the pen provided for them, Mr. Brittle rose to address the court. In opening the case, this popular lawyer reminded the court that he had practised there for very many years, before, indeed, some of his fellow advocates had been born. He ventured to assert, however, on the security of his own untarnished reputation, that never before had he been engaged in a case in which so little of the advocate's skill was required. He pledged his credit with the court and the jury that the case he should present would be unanswerable, for the testimony of a person whose appearance would sustain the truth of her narrative he should call Mrs. Warner. On being called forward, Mrs. Warner manifested a great desire to go backward. It required all the efforts of the official in attendance to push her into the witness box. Having at length, however, got her into the box, he stood on the step behind her, thus effectually preventing her untimely retreat. Mrs. Warner bore out Mr. Brittle's statement that she was the wife of the plaintiff, and that her husband was absent through indisposition. She answered all Mr. Brittle's questions about the capture of the cow in dispute. She felt annoyed at her lawyers persistently preventing her addressing the court on the wrong that had been done by the defendant. She emphatically denied that her husband owed a penny, or any greater or smaller sum of money, to the defendant, and emphatically denied that either the defendant or any other person had any right to take possession of the cow. Mrs. Warner, having been got out of the box without having imparted to the court the fragment of personal history which she was burning to disclose, was followed by a neighbour who had seen Walmsley seize the cow and drive it into his own shippen. He testified that he had expressed his surprise to Walmsley, and that the latter had sworn 2 oaths at him and tersely directed him to attend to his own affairs. As this witness went down, the defendant's solicitor popped up. He said he had declined to cross-examine Mrs. Warner, as he did not want to be the means of inducing anyone to commit perjury. He admitted that the course adopted by his client in order to procure payment of the sum due to him was an irregular one. Still, such a proceeding was not unusual in country places, and he trusted that the jury, when giving their decision, would weigh carefully the evidence he was about to evoke from his most respectable, conscientious, and truth-loving client. In defence of Mr. Walmsley's impetuous conduct, the lawyer maintained that some years ago his client sold a quantity of hay to the brother of the plaintiff. The plaintiff became surety for the price of this hay, but when his brother ran off to America without liquidating the debt, he, the plaintiff, refused to fulfil his engagement, and the defendant had never been paid for his hay from that day to this. After the defendant had backed up his advocate's statements, Mrs. Warner was recalled by Mr. Brittle. She denied that her husband had ever been surety for his brother's debts, or any part of them, and declared that the statement to this effect made by the defendant was entirely destitute of foundation. The judge pointed out that in any case the defendant had no right to take the cow by force. He remarked that such a proceeding was nothing if it was not cattle stealing. He summed up in a manner favourable to the plaintiff, and in conclusion directed the jury to put their heads together and find their verdict. Whether this verdict was to be found in their heads or not, His Honour did not say, and the jury, not being used to the duty, were plainly puzzled, but they forthwith put those same heads together, black, brown, grey, red and bald, while the judge fell to polishing his eyeglasses, and the registrar began the work of making a few cigarettes. Blackhead was foreman. He at once suggested that they should find for the plaintiff. The others agreed, with the exception of Baldhead, who proposed to find for the defendant. "The law is on the side of the plaintiff," said the venerable greyhead, "and justice on the side of the defendant. If we find for the defendant, the judge will overrule our decision," added the foreman. "Then he can do his jurying himself. What's the good of a jury if their word isn't to be taken?" said Baldhead. "Well," said another, "I must be at a sale at Walton at 4 o'clock, so who wins? The majority is for the plaintiff, and the minority's for sticking out for defendant," said Baldhead. "This is a hard seat," said Redhead. "Well, let's give in a verdict of some sort," said the foreman, "or I shall miss that sale," said Redhead, pulling out his watch. "It's 3 o'clock now." Eventually a wrangle ensued. The jury debated the situation for a few minutes, and at length the foreman arose and Baldhead sat back with a smile. The registrar laid his cigarette on the seat beside him and inquired whether the jury found for the plaintiff or for the defendant. "For the defendant." "For the defendant?" echoed the judge with a gasp. "For the defendant," persisted the foreman, and he was about to add that 4/5 of the jury heartily desired that His Honour would refuse to entertain the verdict, when a dangerous gleam in the judge's eye paralysed his tongue. His Honour muttered something about an intelligent jury. Mr. Brittle said that he would be hanged, and added that if he wasn't, the jury ought to be. Mrs. Warner rode home with the banner still under the seat, and the condolences of Farmer Grey fell upon dumb ears. That same evening the bald-headed juryman sat in a certain bar parlour near to the cemetery. Calling the landlord, he said in a voice thick with emotion and other liquors, "John, thou remembers that sale at Samlesbury Dingle the t'other week?" "Aye, certainly." "Thou remembers them pigs as I wanted?" "Aye, certainly." "Thou remembers that chap as kept bidding again me and bout 'em under me nose?" "Aye, certainly." "I've played him his trick back to-day. I were on jury again him at the county court to-day. I lost him day." "Oh, aye." The landlord privately expressed his surprise that a scoundrel like Bill Winks should have been allowed upon the jury. His fellow jurymen regretted, when it was too late, their part in the proceeding. The only satisfied person is Mr. Walmsley, and Mr. Brittle says he'll be brought to justice yet, but not through Mr. Warner. He asserts, more sincerely than ever, that he doesn't like the law, and will have nought to do with it.